are in step 4, the expenditure analysis step of the spending review methodology. And in that step, there are a number of sub-steps. And we are currently busy with the analyze step. And we have got our data, we've found it, we've cleaned it, we've consolidated it, we've grouped and allocated it. We should already be feeling very proud of ourselves. And now we can start to analyze it. So, Mehleli, what is the analyze step?
So, the analyze step for me is really now what I call the data beneficiation process. So everything else is essentially we've extracted our data. So if we use the data mining methodology, we've found our data, grouped and allocated it. So we can now say, these are the different precious stones and we've delivered them to the juror. So the analyze step is now just taking those stones now, which is really your cleaned, grouped, raw data to now make sense of it, to generate those insights embedded within your data. So that's really what the analyze step is. It's about, if I was to put it very simply, is to visualize trends and patterns in that data to generate new insights. Hence my terming it the data beneficiation step.
And I've often heard you, when you've delivered this in training programs, you always say you've got to be clear about the questions that you want to ask, which will drive your analysis.
Yeah.
So what are the most important things that you need to bear in mind when you start your analysis?
So, I mean, analysis, we've all been told, we all know the analytical techniques, and sometimes I feel like by doing it in Excel, the analytical techniques you probably learned by age 13, 14, right? So the only thing we're introducing here is you need to know when to use that analytical technique. And what helps you identify to know that point to use it is a question. What is it that you want to find out? And that question gives you a good sense of direction. So if you're asking me to find out X, to do that, I'll use technique Y. So that's why I always say good analysis starts off with a good question, because it helps the analyst pick the right analytical tool to use.
Mehleli, what types of analysis do we typically do in an expenditure analysis?
So there are quite a number. So I'll say probably present them at 3 levels. So the initial analysis, which is really a good starting point, is just a simple thing to understand the totals, right? We sometimes overlook this. Give you a classic example of why it's important to understand the totals. If you know that if you pick up that the total expenditure by this department is 20 billion, and that 20 billion is in the back of your mind, and then you start copying and pasting something and suddenly your total falls to 10 billion, then something has gone wrong, right? So it's always important. A good starting point is just to understand the totals, be it in aggregate or disaggregated for the different components of the expenditure. And tied to that, I was also just understanding the historical growth rates. I pause there because it's not necessarily the growth rate itself, but just the trend to say, okay, I've got totals for 3 years. What's been happening? It moved from 20 billion to 22 billion to 16 billion. What happened? What is wrong in that first year? Then you can start questioning to say, oh, by the way, this function in this department was moved out in the last 2-3 years. So even before you've gone into the complication of doing the growth rate analysis, just by simple totaling up the numbers, you're just doing that quick sanity check of your data to say, do you have everything there? Are there any potential anomalies? Then the next thing is just now to start mapping out your historical growth rates. You can work that out. There's the normal year-on-year growth that we use. Then the things like the average annual growth rates that you can also calculate. Then the next steps, second layer now, is to start understanding what makes up these totals. What is the largest component in that total? How fast or slow were those components growing? And what share of the total spend is that? And I've been, as I said, you've all done this before. This is simply working out, changing your numbers to percentage of totals or generating a pie chart. But again, it helps you identify your largest components. Then the next level now is really about understanding why things are as they are. And how can these be improved on? So I say the first two steps are just describing the data. So the third thing is where we start comparing our expenditure numbers to the results we're getting, to the amount of inputs that we're using, and say to the nature of the beneficiary. So in technical terms, I would say we start comparing our expenditure to performance information. And by performance information is the results that we get from implementing this program. We start comparing it to administrative information. By administrative information, it's the volume of inputs that we use. So the number of staff that we use, the number of vehicles that we use, computers, fuel consumption, and so forth. And the point around the market, the demographic data that we use. So yes, I'm providing scholar transport to a particular age group. What is the growth rate of that population group? I'm providing social grants to a particular demographic. What are the trends in that particular demographic? So does my expenditure make sense when compared to the trends in performance information, administrative information, or demographic information? So that's where we start now, getting a sense of where can this program be improved upon.
Yeah, I like that. It makes a lot of sense, because from what I understand, you're saying, Michele, is you kind of do some initial descriptions of the data, and then you look at the trends of how the data changes, and then you start comparing it to, would be benchmarking, whatever, to understand, is that an effective or an efficient way in which the money is being spent? And that starts to put the lights on, saying, whoa, we're spending so much on this, whereas it should be much lower. So you start to then follow where your potential savings can be.
Yes. So you start realizing that, I'm still spending 100 rands, but I'm doing less trips a month.
Yeah.
Why am I still spending 100 rands?
Yeah. Or why does my loaf of bread cost 48 rand in the school feeding scheme and 20 in another one?
Correct.
Something is going on, and that's where you follow to look for the savings.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, when you start doing this, we'll go into much more detail. I haven't on how you do benchmarking, but that typical example you use for the loaf of bread is, again, you're understanding the unit cost, and again, you're looking at the markets and saying, does this expenditure number make sense?
Yeah. And Michele, we go through a number of different Excel formulas that you use in the presentation and the Excel tips. So we're not going to repeat those here, but I think it's just to reassure people that if you've got your questions right, the analytical tools follow. Yes. Don't be intimidated by the analytical tool.
Yes.
Get your questions right.
I mean, the one thing that just to highlight in terms of Excel, and I'm sure Karen would have mentioned this earlier, is the pivot function.
Yeah.
So I didn't mention that earlier. That is really, really useful in summing up your expenditure, be it in aggregate or be it in for your different components. And there's quite a number of things you can do with the Excel pivot function. But as I've just said, I think the main takeaway from this introductory talk is the questions. Be aware of what you want to do. So we've said, I want to describe my data. So what's the best Excel function to do that? I want to compare my data to my performance information. What's the best analytical technique to do that? But it's just being aware of that question that you want answered. And then we'll give you guidance on the analytical technique to use.
Great. Ms. Lily, when the analysis step is complete, what do you expect as the output?
So there are two outputs. In the ideal world, yes, I say ideal world for an analyst, the output will just be a simple Excel workbook, which we'll just share with everybody and say, here's the pivot table. It will have the different worksheets showing our analysis, and we'll probably use that to facilitate a discussion to say, this is what our analysis is finding, and here are the main headline messages. And we'll use that workbook to further, as I said, facilitate a workshop and further pursue further lines of inquiry. So, as I said, that's one initial, that's the main output, I guess, from this step, is that Excel workbook. But then, without stealing the thunder from the next step, we know in our environment we have to take those main messages out of Excel and put them in either a Word report or a PowerPoint presentation. So I guess maybe I'm just focusing on the format, but all I'm saying is, regardless of the format, what you'll have now is a good, solid evidence base to support any assertions you make around expenditure on the implementation program. And by any assertions, I mean both the descriptive. So when somebody says expenditure in this particular area has been skyrocketing, you can say, hang on a minute, here's my evidence to support that statement. Here are my historical growth calculations. Where people say expenditure in this area is inefficient, you can show them and say, hang on, given the amount of inputs we're spending and our associated unit costs, that is not the case. So you've got that evidence base to support any assertion. So when you go to your discussions with your departments, you can then say, we as officials believe we can achieve savings in this particular area for reason 1, 2, 3. And here's our analysis to support that. So that is the most critical thing, regardless of that format. It's just that evidence base to support any assertions you want to make around expenditure on your implementation program.
Yeah. Great. You have described this analysis step, Mehleli, and it seems to be, it's the heart of it. It's when all the lights come on and you've got an evidence base, as you say, to make those assertions. Do you have any key pieces of advice for people on this step?
I guess just to reiterate, I can't say enough about a good analysis starts with good questions. And I guess those questions are sort of, as I said, they guide your analysis. You don't want to boil the ocean and just do a whole range of analysis and just get stuck on it. So it's important to identify those good questions. And what will help you is just speaking to people in the know to say, where do you think the opportunities lie in this space? And let that inform the type of questions and shape your analysis. So Yeah, there's that, and I guess the other thing, to reiterate, I mean, two other things. I mean, I've already mentioned it's the good questions, and then you'll always consult someone to figure out how to do it in Excel. The second point is just a word of caution: is that as you do this step, you may find you have to revisit steps 2 and 3 in the analysis. Hopefully not even 1, right? So hopefully you found all your data. But you may find you'll have to go back and clean and regroup your data again, just to help you get to do much crisper analysis. So it's just to remind people that although we're presenting the steps as linear steps, they're actually iterative in practice.
Yeah. So that is the analysis step of our expenditure analysis. Mehleli, thank you so much.
Thank you.